The day was clear and windless when the men of the Essex lowered the boats. A patch of ocean near the equator lay dull as tin, flecked with the steam and white splash of a whale sounding in rage. Lines were coiled in figure eights on thwarts. The boat headers stood in the bows with irons ready, bare feet set against worn planks, every eye fixed on the slick curve that kept sliding out of range and then down again. From the ship, the crew watched the chase over a sea that smacked softly at the hull and made the canvas clap. A harpoon flew, then a second, and the first boat paid out line fast enough to smoke the loggerhead. The whale, a huge bull sperm, surged, sounded, and then was gone. The calm held. The ship lay with her yards braced, vulnerable and still. No one saw the bull turn until he was already moving under the surface, a dark mass rising fast with a V of ripples running before him. The men on deck shouted a warning that died in the windless air. The whale surfaced off the bow and drove straight in. The impact sounded like a timber shed dropped from a roof. The ship shuddered from stem to stern. Planking burst. The bull rolled, slid off, hovered, then gathered speed and struck again, lower and harder, below the waterline. Water pushed through sprung seams. The Essex took on an angle that meant more water would come. Pumps clattered to life. The boats were hauled back alongside in a hurry, oars bristling like porcupine quills. Command fell to two voices, Captain George Pollard, Jr., 29 years old, and his first mate, Owen Chase, a year younger and stubborn as iron. They got the chronometer, bread, and water casks into the boats. Powder, a quadrant, a lantern, nails, spare sails, and a few tools followed. They could hear the hull working, the heavy groan of a ship that had lost her shape. There was no panic on deck, just the practical speed of men who understood that delay would drown them where they stood. By late afternoon, the Essex was abandoned, listing and settling, the sea slapping higher up her side with each lazy set. The crew backed oars clear and watched her die. When the masts finally went, the sound ran across the water flat and strange, and men who had been taught not to cry wiped their faces with tarred hands and didn't speak. They had 3 whaleboats and 20 men. Each boat carried too little food and too little water because a ship that fills does not give you time for fairness. Pollard wanted to steer for the Society Islands to the west, where there was land and fruit and water, but stories of hostile shores turned the vote east. East was windward, toward South America, thousands of miles away. They stitched spare canvas to raise low gunnels and tried to make the boats into little ships. At night, they watched the lantern in the captain's boat fall and lift on the swell like a heartbeat, counted stars, and told each other how far a man could row on a flat sea. Chase kept a log in a cramped hand, numbers and bearings reduced to a steady record designed to keep fear out. The first death came with little warning. Thomas Chappell had earlier set a fire on a barren island as a joke, a thing that had nearly stranded them all. The men carried that memory like a hot stone. It was not Chappell who failed first, but another sailor whose name Chase wrote plainly in the book. Hunger took his will. Heat and salt finished his strength. They sewed him in canvas and slid him into a sea that already knew too much about the Essex. The living trimmed their sails and worked. They found an island they believed to be Ducie, and then another, Henderson, where birds were so thick the air smelled of guano and salt. They shattered shells on rocks and ate until their stomachs cramped. A trickle of fresh water ran from a crevice in the limestone and disappeared into sand. After a week, it was clear the island couldn't carry them. 3 men stayed, gambling that another ship would pass. The rest patched the boats with driftwood and nails and scraped fat from birds to grease the seams. They put to sea again, thinner and quieter than when they had landed. The ocean closed in. Their biscuit ran out. They rationed water by spoonfuls and then by drops from cloth wrung over a cup. They caught flying fish when the nights were thick with wings, and once hauled a shark alongside and hacked it into pieces so tough a man's jaw ached after swallowing. The sun laid a hand on their heads and kept it there. Skin split. Tongues swelled. Men stared at the horizon until their eyes watered and thought they saw a ship every hour. They dreamed in detail about Nantucket kitchens and woke clawing at air. One boat disappeared in a squall. Chase's boat and Pollard's kept company until a gale separated them. In Pollard's boat, a boy named Owen Coffin, his cousin by marriage, sat with his back against the thwart and put his head down to rest more often than he should. When the bread bag showed only dust and the water cask gave back hollow knocks, a choice came the way such choices come to sailors stranded beyond calculation. It was decided by lot. They made the preparations as carefully as they had trimmed sails on deck. The slip of parchment with Coffin's name came up in a stiff, dry hand. He looked at Pollard and told him not to interfere. The second lot chose the hand that would do the killing, Charles Ramsdell, another Nantucket boy who had slept in the same attics and walked the same docks. Ramsdell begged to redraw. Coffin refused. It happened at once. They made a fire on the bottom planking, cooked what they could not bring themselves to swallow raw, and ate in silence because there was nothing useful to say. In Chase's boat, another man's death set the same decision in motion without ceremony. They kept a record of what went where, what was saved, what was consumed, how long it kept. The journal did not make moral space for it, did not plead, did not harden the language beyond what was necessary to tell the truth. The sea was undecided about whether they should live. The boats creaked. A mast step split and was lashed up again with a length of line that had been used first for everything else. On February 18, 1821, an English whale ship, the Indian of London, raised a speck that was not a bird and not a fish. The speck became a boat with a rag of a sail and three figures who did not lift their heads when hailed. The men in the rescue crew thought at first they were too late. Chase and his two survivors were half the weight they had been and past speech. When the cask lid was pried up and fresh water sloshed in a cup, they drank too fast and retched and then drank again. 5 days later, on February 23rd, the American brig Dauphin crossed the track of a second boat. Pollard and Ramsdell were crouched in the stern sheets and would not let go of two small bundles. They had to be talked into lowering them away. The three marooned on Henderson were picked up months later by a British ship. Of the 20 men who had worked the Essex's decks, 8 returned to shore alive. Some shipped out again because it was all they knew. Chase wrote his narrative quickly, a book you can still read and hear the effort to keep it tight and plain. Pollard went back to sea, lost another ship on a coral head near Hawaii, and came home at last to a watchman's post on the night streets of Nantucket. He walked his rounds with a lantern and a memory that grew heavier when the weather went flat and the air smelled of oil. When the lost boats came home one by one, Nantucket tried to make the story fit a church pew. Some men didn't ask questions, others asked too many. The island understood risk and reward. Whales were money, and money carried its own kind of silence. In time, the wreck sank into the long ledger of voyages entered and closed. Tonnage, crew, departure date, return date, fate. But there were things that would not file neatly. Ramsdell and Coffin's mother could not sit in the same room after the first meeting. Chase kept the logbook he had held like a square meal in the boat and added to it only what a man must. Sailors who had never seen the Pacific learned that the greatest distances lie not on charts, but between hunger and the choices it demands. Years later, a young writer collected the accounts and built a novel from them. People read and shook their heads and asked if it could be true. The answer had already been set down in steady ink by men who had no taste for ornament. The Essex, struck down by a whale she had come to kill, left a trail across the ocean that ended not with a wreck on a beach, but with open boats on open water, a line of decisions, and the cost of staying alive when nothing else would keep you that way. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.